Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. I'm your host, Taqib Musa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm joined today from, remotely from Doha, Qatar, with Dr. Joseph Lumbard. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Dr. Joseph Lumbard is an associate professor of Quranic studies at the College of Islamic Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University. He has extensive experience studying contemporary Islamic studies. He has a PhD from Yale University. He's also taught at the American University of Sharjah, at the American University in Cairo, Brandeis University, and his experience as a scholar, as an academic, is quite extensive, which includes as an advisor to the Jordanian Royal Court in various different countries. And so we're really, really pleased to have you. Hopefully this is going to be a multi-episode, multifaceted, multi-tiered discussion. So we're really excited to have you, Dr. Lumbard.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. It's my honor.
Thank you. So today we're talking about, we're going a little bit, taking a step back. So we plan to do decolonial studies. And when we started looking at it, started doing the research behind the episode, we realized that it's very, very important to talk about what underpins everything, which is Orientalism. So we wanted to kick off the discussion on Orientalism. And I think I want to start right at the very basics. So many of our listeners maybe have never heard of Orientalism or have heard of Orientalism vis-a-vis the book written by Edward Said, and they've never heard of anything else in terms of Orientalism. So how would you explain the topic or the concept of Orientalism to a lay Muslim?
Well, I think first of all, when you talk of Orientalism, you need to realize that the term itself is applied in multiple different ways. One of the fundamental things is that Orientalism can be understood just as the study of the Orient. And in this regard, it can be seen as something that is perfectly innocent and innocuous. But the way in which Edward Said is addressing the phenomena that he is addressing in the book by the same name is the means by which this became a way of construing the culture, political environment, and intellectual culture of others, and really kind of for the purposes of dominating over non-Western cultures and even shaping them in the ways that they could then be, shall we say, more pliable subjects. Both in terms of the political complicity of the people, the political malleability of the people, but also in terms of dominating over their intellectual representations.
So I think you mentioned a distinction there between the definition that Edward Said uses and such a concept as actual Orientalism. Is that a fair distinction?
Well, he actually makes a distinction. I mean, he says in his book, he says that you could use the term in three different ways. And I think you can kind of cut it down to two. One is, and this is fair, because there are people who will say, well, I'm an Orientalist, but, you know, I'm really trying to be as objective and fair as I can be. And I don't have any objective of dominating over another culture. I'm really interested in these texts and I write about them, and this is what I think. And this is based upon all of my experience in studying with this. Now, people such as Wa'il Hala would say, well, this has come to such a point that you really can't make a statement like that. You need to realize the depth of secular humanism into which the discipline was at first plunged and from which it arose, and the way in which the entire discipline is actually designed to perpetuate and extend the paradigm of secular humanism and shape the rest of the world according to it, or shall we say the paradigms.
So it's I think Orientalism, the way a lot of people think about it in the modern sense, is as a bygone science, as something that existed before it was used as part of the past or during the domination of the West. To what extent is that fair, and to what extent is it still a relevant topic?
Palestine, Rohingya, the Uyghurs, Kashmir, Afghanistan. That's the extent to which it's still a relevant topic. I mean, these political structures that are occurring, they are not disengaged from the manner in which Muslims have been represented within the academy. I mean, George Orwell, I don't know the exact quote, but he basically says, "Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past." And so, who is writing about us? Who is creating the narratives by which Muslim civilizations and Muslim intellectual traditions are known? Most of that, what we now call knowledge production, is still occurring within Euro-American academies, and there is not really a space for self-representation of Muslims within that. And yet these are the powers that are used to dominate over Muslims. And you just look at the rhetoric that comes out about Palestinians, and you look at people who are actually saying, well, who are claimed to be liberal, but they say, well, the problem is that the Palestinians treat their women in X, Y, and Z manner, and therefore I'm not sure if I should be supporting them. Well, they're buying into an entire narrative there. So you're not sure if you should be on the side of the oppressed because somebody has given you a narrative about how they treat their women, about how they would be non-democratic if they actually could rule over themselves. You've got no proof of that except for these little bits that you're given in the news. That news production comes from university training itself. That comes from an entire intellectual background. Anybody who thinks that this is not still relevant today is really just burning their head in the sand.
So how have we come to kind of this point where, you talked about the oppressor or the oppressed people can become blamed, and in fact the oppressor becomes the one that we in the West, and especially kind of a normal Western person or the normative Western psyche takes a side of the oppressor in many of these cases. How have we come to that, and how has Orientalism helped shape that over time?
Well, this is a very good question, and this is one of the reasons why I think that that it's one of the shortcomings of Edward Said's presentation that I think Wael Hallaq is quite right in addressing in his book Restating Orientalism, part of his whole larger project. But basically, it's a process by which, shall we say, the whole of the self-representation of not just Muslims, but of other peoples was construed as being invalid. There's a way in which you separate the tradition from its own heuristic self-engagement. And then they say that there's kind of it's a cutoff time when you say that no longer are these people qualified to represent their own textual traditions. And hey, maybe they never really have been. The only people that are really qualified to do this now are those with the academic training who are well ensconced within Yale, Harvard, Notre Dame, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, etc. And so what ends up happening here is that over time, the Muslims get to be represented in a way that just supports Western paradigms, that is in accord with secular humanistic paradigms, and becomes further and further detached from the way in which Muslims would present themselves and in which they have traditionally conceived themselves. But this doesn't just happen to Muslims. I mean, you see this happen in traditions all over the world. It particularly happens with indigenous peoples. If you want a great example of how much is really on the line here, look at the history of how Native Americans were represented. Native Americans were, in a sense, they were demonized, and people who wanted to deeply understand them on their own terms were also demonized. And then once they were a completely subjugated peoples, and there was really no chance of there being a new civilization that would arise from those ashes because of the extent of the power that the white man had obtained within the continental United States, or within actually all of the Americas, at that point, people actually became interested in their own narrative. There was more Native American information available before, but only when they had been completely dominated did it actually become of interest to have books such as Black Elk Speaks, in which you could actually let those traditions speak for themselves. And this is something that you see all over, and this is one of the reasons why we have to realize that there's a deep engagement between politics, political domination, wealth, and this type of power, and epistemic domination.
What period would you say this whole thing started? So was it a case that Orientalism followed the power, or Orientalism laid the foundations and the justifications for the subjugation?
Well, I think that it laid the foundations and for the subjugation, but this is where I think that both Tamako Matsuzawa in her book, I forget the exact title, it's like The Foundations or the Beginning of World Religions. She talks about how all of these various disciplines kind of grew out of the Enlightenment, that, anthropology and Orientalism were in particular the disciplines that developed for studying non-Western peoples. Sociology we had for studying Western peoples. And then we had economics. We're only interested in Western economics here. And forget the fact that there's Buddhist economics, forget the fact that there's Islamic economics, even forget the fact that there's traditional Catholic economics. We're only interested in modern economics here. Law and other disciplines, these were all part of how you investigate the West. But then anthropology, and Orientalism in particular, for how you study other cultures. Anthropology is how we study those cultures that we consider to be, quote, less civilized, unquote, again, a loaded term. What do you call civilized? And then Orientalism is how we study those more textual and urban cultures, non-Western cultures that we encounter. Now, this is a post-Enlightenment phenomena, and it really kind of, you might say, takes shape. These particular universities or university disciplines, academic disciplines, take shape within the 19th century and the early 20th century. And then it's in the early 20th century that we have the phenomena of the idea of the world's religions as a discipline also takes shape. And that kind of becomes an extension of Orientalism. And of course, I mean, that's all a whole nother set of categories, because it ends up being really very Protestant ways of conceptualizing religion, but also very secular ways of conceptualizing religion that are going to favor the Christian heritage. They weren't interested in what we now call Judeo-Christian heritage. That is something that really came about in the 1950s and was really in 60s, and was really, a great accomplishment on the part of Jewish intellectuals. But really the Christian traditions and how other traditions were conceptualized in relation to that, and in relation to the secular humanism that developed out of the Christian West. So that really is a point where we can say that a lot of this began. In the way that Edward Said studies this, I think that he doesn't fully go back to those roots as effectively as he could have. And as a result, and this is where Wael Halak comes up and critiques him and says, he doesn't treat Orientalism as actually the product of an entire system of domination over the world. And so anthropology was one of them, even sociology in some ways, even the way that modern economics has been developed, that all of these were actually ways of promoting the Western cultural, political, and epistemic domination of others.
So in terms of the impact on the ground, so I mean, it sounds like it's more of, you've talked about it as a system of total subjugation and domination from all of these different fields. And in the modern sense, it's manifested itself with the things that affect, for most Muslims, affect us day to day, or are the issues that we most commonly associate with Rohingya, Israel, etc. Going back, how has the impact been in the past few centuries post-Enlightenment of Orientalism and Oriental science building up to now? And how has the impact changed
I mean, the impact is tremendous. I mean, when Napoleon was in Egypt, I mean, I've read some stats that they basically on average killed an alim a day. And I mean, that's really incredible. And just then, like, so many of the intelligentsia were in fact killed in various parts of the Muslim world, and there hasn't even been a full accounting of what's happened as a result, the way in which there's been a cutoff from our intellectual traditions just because of the killing of the intelligentsia. But then, in addition to that, there's been this kind of slow trend whereby people within the Muslim world felt that their traditions were, quote, behind the times, and then came to reconceptualize their traditions in many different ways, often due to a sense of inferiority vis-a-vis the West. Some of this comes with, really, you've got very modernistic, reformist traditions, and then on the other hand, you can even see some of the very strident puritanical traditions, some of the most kind of strident expressions of Salafism and Wahhabism. Not all of it, but of Salafism in particular, not all of it, but some of the most strident manifestations are almost like saying the West says, okay, well, you're just a dry legalistic tradition. And they're like, yes, we are. And we're going to double down on that. And turn Islam into this almost just this rote set of laws with almost no life within it. And which is, it's a manifestation that does happen at other times, but this way in which it has arisen in some parts of the Islamic world has almost been a response to the manner in which Islamic civilization was represented by the West. And then on the other hand, you've had those, as I said before, who have tried to kind of really go back into the tradition and say, well, actually, we just need to kind of modernize all of these things, and have ended up, for example, with the kind of extremist Quranist movement, which tries to get rid of all of the hadith. That can really be seen as a response to the criticism of the hadith that occurred within the Orientalist tradition. And in the Orientalist tradition themselves, if you've studied the hadith sciences with a real expert in hadith, and then you read the criticisms that come from people like Golzahir and Shah and Yoimbol, you realize that those people didn't actually really understand how the hadith sciences worked in great depth. And yet this becomes the kind of paradigm that that now shifts. And that paradigm, even when we get away from what the exact words that they said, it still has this residual effect within how the hadith are conceptualized.
I mean, the most interesting thing about what you said there was you described a lot of the modern Islamic movements and how many of them are rooted in, or at least partially rooted in, Orientalist practices where people double down or something on something that kind of, it was the image that the West created, and then people kind of grew to fit those images because there was nothing else available. Do you think, in terms of Muslims around, how many Muslims or how many of our movements have been impacted by the Orientalism, the relationship of power, the domination of the West? And would it even be fair to say that nearly every major Muslim movement that exists right now is influenced or shaped in some way, shape, or form by the overwhelming presence of Orientalism?
Well, they have to be. I mean, given the dominance of Western norms, Western culture, it is the United States that dominates shipping lanes throughout the world. That's the basic purpose of the United States military, is to make sure that they are controlling trade everywhere that trade happens. And even though, so everybody is reacting to it in some way, shape, or form. Even those manifestations of Islam that you could say do maintain greater continuity with the medieval scholastic tradition and represent a dialogue and continuation of it, they cannot but be in dialogue with the transformations that Muslim civilizations have undergone as a result of colonialism.
So coming to kind of the objectives widely of Orientalism, and I think in terms of how it's manifested itself, it's been used a lot as a tool. Do you think when it started off, was that the stated objective? And was it always a case of this is what it's going to be used for? Did it start off as a curiosity and then melded slowly? So kind of what have the objectives of Orientalism been, and how have they changed over the course of the last few centuries?
I don't really think that the objectives of Orientalism have changed so much from what you have as regards Islam in particular. I don't think that they've changed so much from what you see in a lot of the medieval writings about Islam. You know, in some of the very first translations of the Quran, that they're actually saying that this is written. I think that there's an introduction that was written by Martin Luther to a reprint of the Latin translation. So we're talking here in the 16th century, and basically says that this is done so that people can understand the Mohammedan heresy. All right, so because we don't consider it a religious heresy anymore, it doesn't mean it's not treated as a heresy. It's treated as a heresy vis-a-vis secular humanism, which is assumed as a norm. And often in many unstated and subtle ways, but this is assumed as a norm, and so that kind of the way in which a lot of those presuppositions regarding the prophet, and so the prophet didn't meet up to this expectation of what we would want in a prophet. And so you see earlier that they just say that he's a heretic, and then later on people start to say, well, you know, I mean, he wasn't at the level of Moses or Jesus. He was kind of like one of these Greek orators or something. So they're trying to say, well, at least he has some decent status, you know, and then later on people drop that attitude. And you even have in the early writings of people such as Noldeke, who's considered the father of Quranic studies, they're saying that, you know, Muhammad was uttering these statements and may not have fully understood what he was saying, and you know, he certainly had a vivid imagination, but it doesn't rise to the level of Jesus and Muhammad. This is a standard that you have throughout, and this goes into the early 20th century. All right, and so, but then the standards of Western civilization are changing, and the idea of Christian, and here with a lot of these figures we're talking about Christian morality, which then later becomes expressed as Judeo-Christian morality, that they're saying that Islam doesn't live up to that type of morality. Well, what are they basically? They're basically saying that from the current ideological paradigm that we think is proper for a functioning civilization, that they are not capable of that so long as they continue along their cultural and intellectual norms. In other words, it's a heresy from a secular perspective.
So it's morally bankrupt.
Yeah.
I think something you mentioned there, which isn't strictly to do with Orientalism, but it really struck me, is you talked about the evolution of Western moral philosophy almost, or moral thought, from a Christian and then later a Judeo-Christian tradition, and how those two kind of came together. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, and how that process happened? How did the West become so secular, and where did the marriage of Christian, when did Christian become Judeo-Christian?
Oh, well, those are two different things. I mean, Christian became Judeo-Christian after the Second World War and after the Holocaust. I mean, you could almost say that it's almost a function of the guilt that the West felt as the realities of the Holocaust became more apparent. And then, and also, I mean, a very brilliant move. I mean, there are a lot of Jewish intellectuals who basically realized, hey, man, it's do or die. Like, we need to figure out how to survive as a community, because if that happens again, that's the end of us. And so one of the ways to do that was this. And I mean, I have to take my hats off to them. It was a brilliant intellectual move. And I think that Jonathan Sarna, in his book on Judaism in America, I forget the exact title, but I think he identified this as, as perhaps the one of the most important, one of the three most important transformations of Judaism in the United States of America in the 20th century. So that's about the time frame that happens. But then, as regards the moral transformation, oh man, that is I am really not. I don't think I'm qualified to fully answer that question properly. There are people who are great experts in the Western intellectual tradition who could answer that far more effectively than myself. So I'm going to have to take a pass on that particular question.
No, I appreciate it. I think it'll be something we bring up later. But coming back to kind of Orientalism, so I went on a little bit of a tangent about the West's development as in and of itself. What about the West's understanding of Islam and Muslims, especially by the Western elite, and then comparing that to the understanding by Western common folk, and how that's changed over time as well?
Well, I mean, there is more tolerance of Islam on a general level, you might say, and just as a result of immigration. I mean, when you can find some very positive things that are written by some people within the West these days, and some very sympathetic approaches to Islam. Nonetheless, many of the stereotypes that portray Islam and Muslims as the intractable other really do originate within intellectual discourse, and then are continued and perpetuated in many different levels of society. So, for example, we spoke before about how in the history of the translation of the Quran, there were these introductions that would speak about how this is just to understand, this particular heresy, in a sense. And that's the way that it was understood in the Christian West for the most part. It's a heresy. But then in the secular, let's say, as we transform into the secular period in the 19th and 20th centuries, that there is the ways in which we're kind of presenting Muslims as an other who doesn't quite fully have the capacity to live up to the same moral standards that we do in the West. But, they're a major world religion, and so they have some ideas, but they've taken a lot of that from us. And even you even have, this is in Noldeke, that there's the impression that what was good, and for those who don't know, Noldeke is writing in the late 19th or late 20th century. So, and he's considered, as I said before, the father of Quranic studies, that he's actually writing that, that this is a nice approximation of the moral world view of Christianity, but it doesn't fully get there, and it doesn't have the capacity to fully get there. Now, those particular ideas still exist within the certain representatives within the academy, and there's people who will push back and say it doesn't. I can't tell you the amount of messages and emails that I've gotten from other Muslims about, hey, this happened to me, how do I deal with that? Such and such a professor said to me, well, women are 15th class citizens in such and such country that you came from, and this is a woman saying, and so I've come here now, and so this person, he actually thinks that he's going to be liberating me by the fact that I have now come to such and such a country to get an education. And this idea that the Muslims are going to be liberated by the West, that is still there. I mean, that's all over there. That's what, when George Bush is saying you're either with us or against us, and referring to going to the Middle East and Iraq as a crusade, that's exactly what that idea is. And so just as the ideas that the many of the soldiers who went on the Crusades were manifesting the extreme edge of the idea of Islam as a heresy, so too you've got a general feeling, that a general distrust of Islam that exists within many facets of Western civilization, and it's rising up now. I mean, you've got it, like, if you start, like, you could actually do an interesting thing where you, like, if you were to go on Twitter and you were to type, like, Quran in Norway, and type it in Norwegian. It's easy to do Google Translate. Type Quran in Norway. You're going to actually see that most of the Twitter posts are by Norwegians about how Islam is this threat that is spreading. And you'll find the same thing happening in Hungary. You'll find the same thing happening in even countries that we consider to be liberal, such as Norway or such as Sweden. And so this is really a phenomenon that is continuing, in many fundamental ways. These are people that can't live by our values, and our values are superior, and they represent an existential threat to our values. Therefore, they must be controlled and contained. That attitude still exists, and it still exists within the academy, as much as people want to deny it. But there are these subtle ways in which I'd say the hermeneutical exclusion of Muslims, or the hermeneutical marginalization of Muslims, is at the core of the academic discussion of Islam within the Euro-American Academy, which is to say that the methodologies that derive from the secular humanistic paradigm are the proper methodologies for understanding peoples, civilizations, religions, cultures, intellectual traditions, and methodologies that arise from within other traditions may only be studied as an object of knowledge, but may not be viewed as having heuristic value, wherein they could interrogate and present their own tradition to us, or even wherein they could have a interrogation of our paradigms and our civilization that is of value. They are in effect rendered almost like museum pieces. So for example, we study the Hadith and the Quran, and maybe even, we could put Al-Ghazali tafsir over here, right? We study them as an object over here, but the whole tradition that Muslims have developed for interrogating the Hadith and the Quran, for building upon that in all of their various intellectual traditions, be they Sunni or Shiite, that is a separate field of study. And the two should not be used. This field of study, where we're studying their intellectual traditions, that's only an object of study. It may not be a subject which produces the paradigms by which we understand this other material and by which we actually understand and live in the world itself. This is something that there are many scholars who still try to keep this kind of hermeneutical, this seal between the two. And that is a function of what we call kind of epistemic colonization. And that epistemic colonization is fundamental to maintaining the control over people who are seen as other.
So that point about epistemic colonization, I think what you're saying is that it's the effect of colonization, the effect of Orientalistic mindsets and the domination has even seeped into the way we approach Islamic studies, with the very clear demarcation of subjects. And was there a point pre-colonization, pre-domination by the West where that didn't happen, and kind of scholars were more polymaths?
I mean, I think that you could find scholars who were more polymaths, but in terms of this attitude, I mean, it's really the remnant and the continuation of the Christian attitude towards Islamic civilization. I mean, one of the things that some people, I think Edward Said brings this up, and many other scholars have brought this up, is that as regards the Christian West, Islam was always the great other. Islam had, bordered with almost every major world civilization except for Native American traditions, and of course the indigenous peoples of Australia. and probably we could say Japanese civilization as well. But Chinese civilization, Indian civilizations, African civilizations, European civilizations, these are all civilizations, and all of their various religious traditions, these are all civilizations that Islamic civilization bordered on. The Christian West really only bordered on Islam for a period of, some 500 years after you have all of the various conquerings that happened. So this is the major civilization. So Islam was the major other, and Byzantium to some extent, so the Orthodox Church. But that really was the major other, and so it almost becomes a fixation in the minds of Europeans and in the representation of Islam. How do we deal with this heresy? The other thing is that Christianity, took 500 to 600 years to kind of really figure out what it was fully, and even agree upon its book. And even to this day, there are some Christian communities that don't fully agree upon the books that are in the New Testament, so in the Syriac Church. Whereas, so they're still kind of getting their stuff together and getting through a lot of their various disputes. And all of a sudden, Islam comes along, and what we could say is 500 years of development within the Christian tradition happens in about 70 years within the Islamic tradition, and it emerges as a full-fledged religion. And due to kind of the area in which it arose and the weakness of the adjacent empires, also as a powerful empire quite quickly. And so this really it's almost a shock if you've been dedicated to the Christian cause and the development of the Christian church. And so this has almost always kind of had this residual influence over the centuries in the conceptualization of Islam as the great other within European civilization from the Christian era into the more secular humanist era.
I think that point, it keeps striking me, is how that development happened. And I think, as you said, that's a whole other conversation that we need to have in terms of Muslims taking on, or Islam and Muslims generally, Muslim scholarship taking on ideas. What other beliefs have Muslims accepted, especially like kind of common Muslims, not even the scholarly class, but what beliefs have Muslims accepted that have their origin in Orientalist thought that have now become kind of bedrock to us as well?
I mean, I don't know about bedrock. There are a lot of I wouldn't say that they're bedrock necessarily, but one of the things that you do have is the way in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has been kind of almost removed from the understanding and conceptualization of the tradition in certain arenas. So you have this among some modernists, and you have this among some strident puritanicalists, where it's like, okay, he was just like the messenger, and now we're just working with the information, in a sense, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us. This is not how classical Islam functioned. I mean, after the Quran, the two most widely read and distributed books in the whole of Islam are the Burda, the poem on the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Dala'il al-Khairat of al-Jazuli. This is just studying the manuscript tradition. So, and these are devotions upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You even see them that in certain places in Turkey, what do you have in the mosques? You have Quran and verses from the Burda of al-Busiri. So this was part and parcel of how Islam was lived, of how Islam was conceptualized, and part of everyday life even. And this is something that in our intellectual traditions and in the daily lives of many Muslims has unfortunately changed. And a lot of that is a response, at least I think it's a direct response, to the way in which there were efforts to transform the manner in which Islam was practiced and in which Islam was conceptualized
I'm quite interested by that point because, in fact, and again, it's not an academic kind of discussion of in that sense. But I guess my question kind of is what I've heard in some spaces is that the elevation of the prophet's status to kind of a superhuman level is actually something that we got from Christian sources. So is that kind of
a yeah, that's not true.
No, so
I mean,
that's
just, I mean, the discussions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the classical tradition. I mean, in the classical tradition, the Prophet is part of daily life, and this is even when we talk about the Quran, the relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. They actually say that you understand the Quran through the Sunnah. That in fact, the Sunnah becomes more important for how we apply the Quran. You could almost say that it's the Quran that establishes the importance and the validity of the Sunnah, and it's the Sunnah that teaches us how to live by the Quran. And so the two are really intertwined, and in lived Islam, you need the two. And within Shiite Islam, we could say that you also need the traditions of the Ahl-al-Bayt, and the way in which the Ahl-al-Bayt continued the practice of Islam. So they're deeply and intimately intertwined. And many of the manifestations that we've seen of Islam, just to even give us these examples, the Shahada isn't Muhammadan kana Rasulullah. It's not he was the messenger of God, it's he is the messenger of God right here, right now, in your daily life. From the moment you wake up, every practice that you do, everything, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the messenger of God. And this aspect of Islam, that this was how Islam was lived and conceived for the vast majority of Muslims, has been lost.
That's I think that's quite enlightening, and again a bit of a paradigm shifter. I think my kind of last question.
I just want to make a correction. I don't want to say it's been lost entirely. I mean, there are communities that maintain that, so it's not lost entirely. But in terms of it being the way in which Islam is conceived on a civilizational level, it has very much been lost.
In terms of Orientalism and the way it manifested itself, the way it was coupled with power and the phenomenal impact it had on even the development of Islam, even things we've talked about, even the way we conceptualize our own Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is this a uniquely Western phenomenon? Is this something we've ever seen two civilizations do beforehand, or one civilization do to the other, more like before? Is it a uniquely Western phenomenon? Is it something that's only happened now?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I take Wa'il Halak's side in this, which is that there was a unique form of knowledge that developed in the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment era, that could be, deeply blended with power structures and political structures, and that this is unique in history. But honestly, I don't know that it's a question we can answer. There's really no way to answer it, because many of the tools for the perpetuation of the structures that we identify with Orientalism had to do with a lot of the technologies of domination that arose in the 20th century in particular, but in the 19th century as well. And if another civilization had already had power structures in its favor at that time, would they have been as oppressive and as dominant? We would all like to think no, but that's not a question that we can ultimately answer. Within Islamic law, there are principles that say that other religious communities should be able to continue to live by their own standards as regards their communal law. And we don't have a history of Muslims going in and trying to fully appropriate the intellectual traditions and dictate to Jews and Christians the nature of their traditions. For example, Coptic Christianity The nature of Coptic theology is very much opposed to anything that would be more amenable to a Muslim ruler of any kind, and that community has continued. Yes, sometimes under oppression. I'm not exonerating Muslims for periods of oppression of the Coptic community, but in terms of trying to define Coptic Christianity in its image, in terms of Muslims trying to define Syriac Christianity in its image, that has not happened in the same way. We don't have these entire books where people are writing about these traditions, trying to pretend that they don't have skin in the game when they're actually really trying to rewrite those people's traditions for them.
The classic example that's always quoted, and again, I'm not sure how historically valid this is, but it's that the Mongols came and they took over Baghdad, and there was a big loss of knowledge, but the domination lasted. And yes, it set Baghdad back a lot, but there was the domination of the Islamic world, and the Muslim world wasn't in the same way. And do you think that's again down to the technologies, or was it that the West came with Orientalism, and so their worldview was so different that they were able to just completely shatter the edifice that the Muslims had built? Or was it the timing that really worked out, where it just so happened that the Muslims were right at the bottom?
Honestly, that's a really tough question to answer. I mean, one of the things, like I said, is under the rule of Napoleon, they did actually kill a lot of the intelligentsia, those people who would be seen as being the greatest threat. And the Russians did the same with some Muslim groups in the Caucasus. And so this was a phenomena that unfortunately happened. And there are, I think that there was a kind of almost a wily nature to the process of colonialism, and that they realized in a way that one of the best ways to dominate peoples was to limit and redefine their traditions and even their educational systems. I mean, when you have in India, that they really kind of completely restructured the educational systems in ways that cut people off, from their traditions. And you still have in many parts of the Arab world that the people who are at the top are the people who are trained in Western disciplines. Doctors at the very top. Everybody in every country in the Muslim world wants their kids to become a doctor, and then lawyers and businessmen and all this stuff. And at the bottom of the totem pole, why is your son going to Al-Azhar? What's wrong with him? Is he stupid? I mean, literally, this is a question that parents will get if their child goes to Al-Azhar. I had a good friend who wanted to go into religious studies. And he came from a wealthy family. He would actually, his family could still take care of him if he did this. They wanted him to become a doctor. And when he broke the news to his family, his best friend, who's also a friend of mine, knew when he was going to do it. He calls him up on the phone, and he says, "Hey, how'd it go?" And my other friend, he just says, "World War III. I'll call you when I can." Hangs up the phone. This is like, but this is something that you have all over. And this is a bright guy who really could succeed in anything that he did, and probably, could have gone to Yale or Harvard for a PhD, given, his discipline and his intellect. But, his parents don't want it. And this is the way that it's seen throughout. There's this bias against our own traditions that you have. And that masterful way of kind of turning the elite of the civilization to be in favor of the paradigms that prefer or give power to the colonizer, that I think is unique.
I think that's it's kind of striking how relatable that is to me, but also it's really segued us perfectly into what this episode was building the foundation for, which is when we talk about what happens next. So we've understood where we're coming from. We can talk a little bit about colonization, its impact, but actually what the future holds is decolonizing the education, the mindset, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So kind of it's been a very interesting discussion. I really appreciate your time. And I think I've definitely picked up a lot from it. There was a couple of aha moments. So I really appreciate your time. It's been a very good conversation, and I think we've reached a very good point at which to stop. I find myself often saying, "Oh, we need to end now because of time," but I think here we've actually covered a lot of ground. It will be very interesting to see what our listeners take away from this, and it will be great
Let's stop with that relatable story that almost every Muslim family has had.
Yeah. And it will be interesting to build up on that story and that educational discussion, why Muslims are choosing what they're doing, and how do we decolonize the education, go for it. So it's really laid the groundworks for our next episode. So you've basically done my work for me.
Inshallah. Well, I hope so, because I'm better at post-colonialism than I am at talking about the rise of Orientalism itself. Because as you can see, there are historical things there that I think other people could actually trace better than I can myself. But post-colonialism, I think I can do that better, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. So yeah, that's been a really good episode. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.